I think everyone, regardless of what your views are, most people, I should say, will want to see permanent peace in the Middle East. The Middle East in this context, really, I should say the Near East, and talk about Israel and Gaza. But anyone with human conscience would want to see this over. But I do apologise for having some degree of caution about it, because the history of the Middle East is that more often than not, there's periods of peace and then it falls back to square one, or violence breaks out in some capacity. I mean, I think of the Oslo Accords in 1995. What happened? A far right extremist assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in Israel, and then that fell apart. Um, the second Intifada broke out in the 2000s. I just think, as welcome as these developments are in the last couple of days, there's a sense of perhaps premature optimism. I mean, really, to see if this holds out, it will take weeks, months, maybe even years. Um, I still think that Donald Trump, you know, it's a situation whereby American diplomatic efforts have definitely played a big part in this, and I think it would be a bit petty to pretend otherwise. So Stephen Witkoff and the American delegation does deserve credit for that. Donald Trump deserves credit for it. And yet, the paradox with this is that American weapons have directly killed Palestinian civilians. It's a bit like someone wrote into the eye and said it's a bit like an arsonist who comes along, or someone who gives the arsonist the match and kerosene, and then 10 minutes later pours out the fire. So it's a bit uncomfortably with me to give Trump too much credit when he has blood on his hands, without question. There's been reports of some infighting in Palestine between various factions. That isn't surprising. It's happened before. In 2007, there were violent battles between Fatah and Hamas. And it's not surprising that there might be a violent power struggle here, which is not good. But on the good side of things, so not coming across as overtly negative, a lot of the hostages have now been reunited with their families. There was said to be 48 left, 20 alive, and 28 dead. And, those people will need to be repatriated. The surviving hostages, those guys are going to need, and I think it's mostly men, I'm not sure if there's any women left, but they're going to need therapy, they're going to need rehabilitation. It's going to be, you can imagine the ordeal that they've been through. And I have enormous sympathy for those people. It's a hellish experience they've been through. At the same time, hundreds of Palestinian prisoners have been released back into Gaza. But, what are they going back to? Their families may have been wiped out. That's why I'm a little bit cautious. I heard a sermon at the weekend at my local church, and the minister mentioned a good point, and he has spent time in the Middle East, so he knows what he's talking about. What about the orphans in Gaza? Will there be... He said he welcomed the ceasefire, but there's a difference between a ceasefire and peace. Now, those orphans, what becomes of them? Could they become radicalised as young men because their families have been wiped out? This isn't his words, but this is my conjecture into it. And it really isn't rocket science. When you have such devastation and such despair, when the place looks like a nuclear fallout zone, when entire families have been eradicated, there's going to be very deep bitterness there. And there may well be deep bitterness in Israel as well. But I have to say this, some of the Israelis that have been interviewed, I find their open-mindedness incredible, given how much they've suffered, how much their loved ones have, they haven't known the fate of their loved ones. The open-minded approach they take, even now, they still talk about a two-state solution. So if they could do it, there's no reason Netanyahu should be excused for his dogged attitude against that. What I want to talk about in this video, so that's the situation on the ground. I want to talk about my thoughts on the pro-Palestinian demos, because these people I'm talking about, the pro-Palestinian demos explicitly, have been attacked as kind of radicals and Hamas cheerleaders and all the rest of it. So I want to first of all offer my views on that. I have never joined one of those demos, and there's good reason for that. But also, what I think has what's been obvious in this country in the discourse, I think there is a big proportion of the British right, and I shouldn't say this is across the board, but frankly, a lot of the British right, political right, in their determination to make excuses for Israel no matter what, by extension, they are effectively dehumanizing the Palestinians. Now, when I say dehumanization, what I'm talking about is a very dismissive attitude. And I'm going to cite an example of this, an attitude that basically treats Palestinian lives as secondary, as literally worth less than Israeli lives. And I'm not saying that to be dramatic or confrontational. That is just the attitude that you hear from these people in their extreme pro-Israel bias. It kind of disgusts me. And that's why there's significant anger against Israel, but also against those who defend Israel. Now, there can never be an excuse for anti-Semitism, collectively blaming all Jewish people for what Netanyahu's government does. However, frankly, there are some people who claim to represent the Jewish community, and they are fiercely pro-Israel. I don't think it's reasonable to come out publicly and defend Israel and then complain when people criticise you. That's different from anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism would be saying, I hate this person because they are Jewish, or trying to condone violence against Jews. But frankly, anyone who supports Israel should should expect criticism. They can stand by their view if they want. We have free speech. But I wonder, do they support free speech for their critics? Do they support free speech? For example, I would cite the campaign against anti-Semitism. Some of the things they've come out with, for example, their attacks on the actress Miriam Margolyes, although she herself is Jewish, I think it amounts to censorship. I'm going to cite an example here in the Express. Now, the reason I cite this, it's kind of interesting because the Express, although it's certainly a right-wing paper, they had a cover recently, to their credit, it was about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago now, showing a starving child in Gaza. And I thought, okay, there's a right-wing publication is actually showing this. The Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail don't bother, so fair play to the Express. And then today, this is a few days ago, it's from October the 10th, I see this comment from Angela Epstein, and she's a guest columnist. She's actually with the Jewish Chronicle, and she's basically denying there's a genocide. And she's saying, war is awful, of course there's suffering. This is the piece. Angela Epstein in the Express, and she's saying, we hear it not only from knuckle-headed marchers chanting Free Palestine, but never Free Palestine from Hamas, but from the self-promoting celebrities and entry-level podcasters. By parroting the baseless genocide narrative, these voices have not only distorted reality, they have armed with anti-Semitism. What Angela Epstein shamefully is doing is trying to conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. This is no better than Islamists saying that if you criticise Islamic fundamentalism, you're an Islamophobe. I have a big problem with people like Angela Epstein who use anti-Semitism as a way to try and silence debate. And that's exactly what she's doing. Shameful. The thing about genocide, the charges of genocide, it isn't just coming from hard left pro-Palestine demonstrators. This is now being voiced at UN level. It's official, in fact, at UN level. Numerous aid agencies have reported the situation on the ground. Israel has withheld aid. Now, the common argument against this from the right is if Israel really wanted to commit genocide, it could have done it on October the 8th. The implication being Israel's a nuclear power and it's proportionally, very well supplied and armed little country, so it could have just done that. But if we look at history, genocides don't happen overnight. It's a process. And the fact of the matter is, Israel has withheld aid. Israeli ministers have claimed there's no humanitarian crisis when there blatantly is, so they're barefaced liars. and they have been killing civilians with impunity. I don't really accept this argument, oh, well, they give warnings first. Oh, well, that's fine then. It's fine to collectively punish Palestinian civilians as long as they give a warning first. You know what? Terrorist organisations have also been known to give warnings first. That doesn't exonerate them from the civilian blood on their hands. Likewise, I think far too many excuses are made for Israel. And, I was like this a lot of the time up until probably a year ago. Can't pinpoint the exact point, but I always played the devil's advocate. I would just believe whatever the IDF said, more or less. I'd say, oh, well, it's awful, but Israel's trying its best to avoid civilian casualties. That narrative no longer works because there's a far right government in Israel, and you have to consider what's been happening in the West Bank as well. What's Angela Epstein's answer for settler violence? Is she going to deny that? And she's not the only one, there's others. But I think it's pretty disgusting and cynical to try and silence debate by weaponizing anti-Semitism. Now, of course, actual anti-Semitism should be condemned. And what is it? In the common understanding of the word, I mean, you could get into pedantics and say Semitic people include Arabs, okay. But in all honesty, anti-Semitism is deemed to be anti-Judaism. So hatred of Jewish people, violence against Jewish people just for being Jews, treating them as others, like non-British, etc., etc. I would say those sort of things are anti-Semitic. Getting into conspiracy theories about Jewish world control, all that sort of thing. I have always stood against that, and I always will. But for right-wing Jewish people who are going to forcefully defend the state of Israel, don't whine that you're going to get criticised. Because to many people that is a deeply immoral position when Israel has killed so many people. Now, I hope the ceasefire lasts. Israel's pulling out. Hamas, part of it I understand is they have to decommission weapons. I have always said Hamas is a big part of the problem. And unlike those pro-Palestinians who chant from the river to the sea, I do see Hamas as a problem. Now, that gets me on to the pro-Palestine demos. After the attack at the Manchester synagogue, politicians across the board were saying, just for one day they should call off the marches. I understand the argument about that because just to be respectful to the victims, just one day, don't do it. But there is another argument against that, and it was made by Zach Polinsky, who is the new leader of the Green Party. I don't give much time to the Greens, but he did make a valid point, and he's Jewish himself. He said that anti-Semitism cannot be used to stop legitimate protest. It's not verbatim, but that's the point he was making in his op-ed in the Eye. He's Jewish himself. So another thing that we notice is right-wing Jews seem to think that they speak for Jewish people alone. There are many Jewish people who are fiercely critical of Israel and the Netanyahu government. Now, the stupidity of anti-Semitism, and the reason it is a toxic ideology that needs to be confronted, is it just lumps all Jewish people as one and the same. So the irony is a Jewish person who opposes Netanyahu may even have been in one of those marches, then finds himself tarred with the same brush. It's as boneheaded as, lumping all Muslims in with ISIS or Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or Hamas. Crude generalizations, it's common sense. They're ignorant and they don't help anyone. But I really do think that the right in this country are guilty of dehumanizing Palestinians because the way they talk about them, they use terms like collateral damage or dismissive things like, well, it's tragic, people die in war. I guarantee if 20,000 Israeli children had been killed, they would be taking a very, very different attitude. They wouldn't be playing the devil's advocate and saying, oh, well, the Palestinians give warnings. And yes, I know that they don't. But the fact of the matter is, this amounts to collective punishment. Netanyahu is running a far-right government, and if you look at some of the statements they come out with, this goes well beyond self-defense. There's been a hostile relationship between many of the hostages' families and the Israeli government because they haven't been convinced that the priority has been their families. Now, I hope all of those people are reunited. I also hope that Palestinian prisoners, some might call them hostages, are reunited with their families if their families are even still alive. But I just find it grotesque that the right has this, just treats all Palestinians as one and the same as Hamas. Now, the argument they would make is, well, Hamas is the government in Palestine and the Palestinians put them in. Hamas are thugs. Do you really think it's easy to stand up against Hamas? I do agree with the argument that there should be support given to Palestinians who have opposed Hamas. But the same people who argue that have no problem lumping in Palestinian civilians with Hamas. So they are dehumanizing them, actually. They might say, oh, war is tragic, it's awful, children are dying, yet they'll simultaneously talk about them, the Palestinians, as if they're all one and the same, as if they're all the same as Hamas terrorists. That's grotesque and it is dehumanizing. And to deny the genocide, this has met the definition of genocide on so many levels. To deny that is again dehumanizing Palestinian suffering, dehumanizing the Palestinians, and I should say trivializing the suffering. And it's always October the 7th, October the 7th. What happened on October the 7th was repugnant. It was a vicious terrorist attack against largely civilian population. As a strategy, it was incredibly stupid of Hamas. It wasn't liberation. Raping Israeli women is not liberation. Targeting Israeli civilians is not resistance. It's terrorism. But I would argue Israel absolutely is guilty of state terrorism. I see no moral difference, quite frankly, between Hamas barging into a kibbutz and slaughtering civilians and Israel slaughtering civilians from the air. Is there really a moral difference? Israel's apologists will say, oh, well, they give advance warning. But Israel is supposed to be the nation state. And so many things that it has done, the apologists come out. I mean, it just doesn't matter what Israel does. They will come out and defend it. I have a big problem with that. Because this wouldn't be excused for pretty much any other country. After September 11th, the United States, of course the war on terror was deeply controversial, but I would argue even the United States didn't collectively punish the way Israel has done to the Palestinians. I put a lot more weight onto Patrick Cockburn in the Eye, who I think is really experienced. He really knows what he's talking about when it comes to the Middle East. So I put more weight on his words than some of these pro-Israelis. I should say, by the way, I was talking about the Palestinian demos. The reason I haven't joined them is because I think there are some pro-Hamas cheerleaders among them. I think there are some anti-Semites among them. But I also think it's a distortion to say they're all raging anti-Semites. Of course there's anger in those demos. Why wouldn't there be? How can you not be angry when children are being killed, when children are being starved? And, we talk about British Jewish people who may have relatives in the Middle East. Well, what about British people who may have relatives in Palestine? I understand that Humza Yousaf, the former Scottish First Minister, had relatives in Gaza while it was being bombed. So again, it's just Palestinians are second class. There's fundamentally a different attitude that the right wingers have. Now, to be fair, again, there will be some of the pro-Palestinian crowd who do themselves no favours by actively celebrating the events of October the 7th as liberation. If you're doing that, you're absolutely destroying your own movement. You're absolutely giving it bad PR because you're going to come across as terrorist sympathisers. And early on, a lot of those demonstrations, I was disgusted by posters celebrating Hamas, and I still am. One woman was cutting up ribbons for the hostages. That's absolutely stupid. She said it was celebrating genocide. How? Those are just people concerned for their relatives or their friends. That's boneheaded. So frankly, there's incredible stupidity on both sides. And there's dehumanization of both sides. But why am I talking about the right? I'm talking about this because they carry more clout in this country, I would say, overall. You see it in the Daily Mail, you see it in the Daily Telegraph, you see it amongst Reform, the Conservatives, and it sickens me. Every civilian life should be deemed to be equal. And unfortunately, it isn't seen that way. So a dead Palestinian, oh well, it's sad, but it's collateral damage. a dead Israeli, terrorism, awful. When really we should be looking at it is both cases are awful. So, attitudes like Angela Epstein's are not unique. I think the British right are guilty of dehumanizing the Palestinians, treating them like they really are second class, like their lives worth less. And there's a lot of arguments made to this end. One is constantly regurgitating Israel's lies and absolutely putting out whatever the IDF says is gospel truth. We know it's not true. We know they've lied because it's been empirically proven that they've lied. For example, that there's no humanitarian crisis. There clearly is. That's one aspect of it. Also, collective punishment, treating all Palestinians as if they're one and the same as Hamas. Um, and the pro-Palestinian people haven't always helped themselves either. There are pro-Hamas people in the midst. I think responsible organisers should expel them or at least distance themselves from them. They'll often say, Jewish people are welcome at our demos, and there are Jewish people. But if you have Hamas cheerleaders in your midst, it's not exactly good PR. Hamas is rightfully a proscribed terrorist organisation in Britain. And look at the way Hamas treats Palestinians. So I've always been very clear, I'm anti-Hamas. I think Hamas is a big part of the problem. And I do blame Hamas for a lot of the suffering of the Palestinian people, as well as Israelis. But the argument is all the suffering is Hamas's fault. No, Israel is responsible for its own military actions. Israel is responsible for carpet bombing the place to make it look like a nuclear fallout zone. That's Israel's responsibility. Israel is responsible for settler violence in the West Bank. Israel is responsible for the sort of statements that have come out prior to the ceasefire about turning it into real estate. Well, actually, that was made by Trump, but endorsing those sort of statements. So anyway, I really hope this lasts, but there's a lot of distortion in the narrative of this conflict, of this genocide. And I think the right wingers need to be called out when they dismiss Palestinian suffering the way they do. And yes, those pro-Palestinians who cheer for Hamas, I think they're probably a minority, but they're a vocal minority. So people like Ben Jamal, who's the organizer of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, he will be careful. He won't be anti-Semitic. He won't praise Hamas himself, but he should acknowledge there are some Hamas cheerleaders in their midst. And as for Jewish groups who support Israel, don't complain then about being criticised. You can't have it both ways. You can't say, oh, but we're British Jews. We're not responsible for what Netanyahu does, but then go on to defend Netanyahu and the Jewish state. You can't have it both ways. If you're going to defend Israel, people will disagree with you. Now, that disagreement should be solely focused on the conflict and solely focused on human rights and solely focused on what Israel's doing to the Palestinians, not on anti-Judaism. Because, like I say, some of the most focal groups against the Netanyahu government are Jewish. For example, the Jewish Voice for Peace. So I do have a problem with right-wing British Jews who think they alone are the voice of the Jewish community. The Jewish community, like every other community, is diverse. So they shouldn't claim they alone represent that community. Now, of course, to an anti-Semite, just as Israel doesn't differentiate between Palestinian children and Hamas, anti-Semites don't differentiate between liberal Jews, conservative Jews, anti-Netanyahu Jews, and so on. They hate Jews, and that Jew hatred is the toxic aspect of that. But I do think, I will say this, and it might be controversial, but I think it has to be said, since the Manchester synagogue attack, we have clearly seen the British right trying to silence debate. And I think it was disgraceful for the Prime Minister to say it was unpatriotic for people to rally. Now, finally, on the point about the demonstrations, they should be peaceful. Anyone throwing weapons at the police or vandalising or anything like that, they should be arrested. Some of the actions of Palestine Action, vandalising RAF planes, are not harmless. They should be arrested. Any just stop oil tactics are boneheaded and thoroughly stupid. They are deemed to fail, just like they failed with just stop oil. But people simply holding up placards That is a fundamental democratic right, so long as they're not using violence, so long as they're not deliberately hurting the public, i.e. just stop oil tactics, then really we're talking here. I will say this, I think that the Palestinian demos have more of an argument actually than just stop oil. Just stop oil comes out and says billions of people are going to die in the next couple of years. The pro-Palestinian demos say there's a genocide in Gaza, which is recognised by the UN. I think they actually have a stronger claim than just stop oil. But anyway, I'm not naive. I think there's unpleasant aspects in those demos. That's why I personally haven't been involved in them. And also because I don't think it's black and white. And I think chanting from the river to the sea explicitly implies the removal of the state of Israel. Now, that is just not a starting point. Israel is not going to go anywhere. A two-state solution means Israel stays. But you know what? A two-state solution is also against what Hamas wants. Hamas doesn't want a two-state solution. That's why those who were attacking Starmer and Macron and other leaders who were supporting this were saying it was victory for Hamas. Absolutely absurd. The heckling of David Lammy was absurd. To suggest that recognising Palestine somehow encouraged an anti-Semitic attack is ridiculous. And you know, I give some charity to those people because they were raw. They could well have lost their friends in that attack, so emotions were raw. But I still think heckling Lammy was wrong. I think it was misplaced. So I'll wrap this up. But in summary, I do not like the way the right approach this whole thing. Their entire attitude is the Palestinians are all one and the same as Hamas. However, the pro-Palestinian demos need to be very careful. Now that there's a ceasefire, are they going to keep demonstrating? Because there may well be disruption to the public, and they should learn from the mistakes of Just Stop Oil. I was, very vocally against Just Stop Oil because what were they doing? Boneheaded, brainless stunts like vandalising the grave of Charles Darwin and Stonehenge and other such ridiculous things. With the pro-Palestinian groups, they're a bit more focused, I would say. But they need to be very careful not to polarise the public. And they need to really distance themselves from the anti-Semites and Hamas cheerleaders in their midst. They would argue there's Jewish people that march with them. But they could do something, for example, like explicitly condemn anti-Semitic violence. But, we saw a mosque targeted after the Manchester synagogue attack. So hate crimes are unfortunately on the rise in this country. And it's just boneheaded to target an entire group as one and the same. But anyone defending Israel can't complain about then facing scrutiny or criticism. And I do frankly think there are some right-wing British Jews who will use anti-Semitism to try and silence debate. Because we've seen it. If someone is expressing hatred towards them as Jews, that's anti-Semitism. But simply disagreeing with them in their defence of Israel or challenging their defence of Israel, that can't reasonably be deemed to be anti-Semitic.